One of the more uncomfortable encounters an adventurer may experience while wandering a known or unknown world is with a cliff. Unlike dragons, ogres, carnivorous shrubbery, or politicians, cliffs generally make no effort to announce themselves beforehand. They simply wait. This has resulted in a long and distinguished history of adventurers discovering cliffs entirely by accident. Sadly, it is not an accident they tend to recover from. Fortunately, the Cartographer's Guide to Adventuring has much to say on the subject. Cliffs, for the most part, are wholly misunderstood. To the average traveler, a cliff is simply a steep drop, nature's way of saying stop, albeit without the obvious glaring red sign, and the consequences for running said stop sign being much more severe than a ticket from a uniformed officer. This definition is technically correct, though only in the same sense that a library is a building full of paper. In reality, cliffs are considerably more complicated. Some cliffs rise from the earth, others are carved into it, some appear suddenly through earthquakes and tectonic violence, others require millions of years of patient erosion and several committees' worth of geological paperwork. Cliffs, despite their reputation as sudden endings, are in fact extremely organized features with very strong opinions about gravity and a tendency to take it upon themselves to decide what goes where. They have redirected rivers, shaped coastlines, altered migration routes, and on at least one occasion accidentally launched an entire sentient species into its proper evolutionary niche. The most famous example of this would be the lambings. Search for lambings in the guide to learn more about how cliffs intervened on their behalf. But what exactly constitutes a cliff? Surprisingly, geology remains somewhat reluctant to provide a definitive answer. There exists no universally agreed upon minimum height, width, steepness, or quantity of adventurers required to fall from it before a geological feature may officially be classified as a cliff. As a result, what constitutes a cliff depends almost entirely upon who is asking. To a 40-foot giant from the planet Gunkfar, a 13-foot drop is an inconvenience. To a squirrel, it is an opportunity. To an ant, it is a theological event. This has led to a considerable amount of disagreement. For practical purposes, however, a cliff may generally be described as any significantly steep face of rock, sediment, or earth, possessing a strong likelihood of altering one's plans upon reaching the edge. Cliffs generally fall into two broad categories: incised cliffs, where the land has been cut away, and emergent cliffs, where the land has risen and left an edge behind. An incised cliff is perhaps the easier of the two to understand. Rather than being built upward, it is created by the removal of material. Rivers carve canyons, glaciers gouge valleys, oceans gnaw patiently at coastlines. Given sufficient time, the landscape begins to resemble a place where an enormous quantity of land has gone mysteriously missing. Emergent cliffs operate in the opposite manner. Rather than something being removed, something arrives. Tectonic forces lift the land upward. Resistant layers remain standing, while softer material surrounding them erodes away. The result is a landscape where the earth appears to have risen from the surrounding terrain and left a rather abrupt edge behind. Plateaus, mesas, and the more antisocial of the bunch, sea-stack formations, belong to this family. For those who cannot be bothered with the whats and whys of it all, the distinction is quite simple. One is an innie, one is an outie. No matter how impressive, dramatic, or how much they resemble hairstyles of 90s hip-hop culture, every cliff is engaged in an ongoing argument with gravity. Gravity, for its part, has never lost. As a result, cliffs are constantly being carved, undercut, fractured, weathered, eroded, and occasionally reduced to a collection of regrets at the bottom of a slope. It is this constant abuse that eventually produces what geographers refer to as a talus slope. Contrary to popular belief, a talus slope is not formed by sediment piling itself against a cliff face like a horde of zombies constructing an increasingly unpleasant staircase in an effort to scale a city wall. Nothing in geology behaves this enthusiastically. Instead, a talus slope forms when pieces of a cliff break away and fall to its base, where they remain indefinitely. The resulting accumulation of rock fragments tends to gather at the foot of the cliff in a manner best described as persistent, apologetic, and unwilling to move on. Much like a particularly clingy former romantic partner, the fallen pieces spend the remainder of their existence gathered around the cliff they once belonged to, quietly hoping the relationship can be repaired. Not all cliffs, however, possess the patience required to wait millions of years for erosion to complete its work. Some prefer a more direct approach, albeit with less exaggerated effect. Among the most common examples are fault scarps, which form when movement along a fault causes one side of the landscape to suddenly shift relative to the other. In practical terms, the ground breaks, moves, and leaves behind a cliff. Geologists often describe this process using terms such as hanging walls and footwalls. Adventurers tend to summarize the phenomenon as the land was over there yesterday. Fault scarps are among the fastest methods by which a cliff may come into existence, often appearing in a matter of seconds. After all, the quickest way down a mountain is to build stairs. The quickest way to build stairs is to hire an earthquake, which, after a few enthusiastic attempts, can leave behind enough fault scarps for one to descend with only mild regret, providing one is not particular about handrails. This approach is generally discouraged, owing largely to the difficulty of finding an earthquake willing to work regular hours. Sadly, not all cliffs remain attached to one another forever. Some, much like the lead singer of a famous band, get it into their head that they can do much better as a solo act. Thus, they depart with a false sense of confidence to go stand proudly and alone just off the coast, where they receive much less fanfare and attention. The result is what geologists refer to as a sea stack. A sea stack, not to be confused with the reptilian slee stack of late 20th century Earth television, despite several unsettling similarities, is an isolated pillar of rock that was once part of a larger cliff formation. Over time, waves exploit cracks and weaknesses in the coastline, gradually eroding the surrounding rock until a detached column remains standing offshore. In this sense, it is actually less like a lead singer quitting a band in a hissy fit, and more like a lead singer who went crowd surfing and never quite made it back to the stage. Indeed, that is a far more accurate analogy, albeit much less dramatic and therefore less likely to make the tabloids. In summary, the Cartographer's Guide provides a few simple rules for adventurers who might happen upon a cliff while gallivanting about the wilderness. Rule 1. If uncertain whether something is a cliff, throw a pebble over the edge. Should the pebble continue falling long enough for you to reconsider your life choices, it is probably a cliff, and a tall one at that. Rule 2. Before stepping over the edge, determine whether you are an avian species. Do not attempt to determine this experimentally. Just ask the ostrich or penguin and see how that went for them. Rule 3. Do not set up camp at the base of a cliff currently in the process of becoming a tailor's slope. Rule 4. If you encounter a sea stack standing proudly offshore by itself, politely avoid going on and on about how wonderful your time was touring its former cliff. They don't like to be reminded about how grand their life once was. Rule 5. If you insist on waiting at the top of a cliff for an earthquake to create stairs, because you simply must descend and can't be bothered to learn the art of belaying, don't. They are perpetually late for work and have a much longer lifespan than you do. Rule 6. Don't even bother. Just avoid cliffs altogether. They are temperamental, stubborn, and who really has time for that anyway? Should further information be required, the guide recommends consulting a cartographer, geologist, or squirrel, in roughly that order.